All right, so we just finished up a series called Real Mature, and we have been looking at what real maturity looks like in the mirror, and also what real maturity looks like to those around me. Like if I dial up my commitment to the process of following Jesus, who am I becoming, and how am I being perceived by others around me? In part one, we talked about who we're becoming, like how I'm changing, and what maturity looks like while I'm changing. And the big focus there was that it's not someone who's becoming outwardly religious, but someone who's bearing fruit, meaning somebody who is becoming more loving, more peaceful, more joyful, more patient. To summarize it and simplify it, it's really someone who's becoming like Jesus. And we said, you become like Jesus by being with Jesus. Now, we've talked about that a little bit more in a series we did called The Way, but what I wanted to do during this little extra thing here is talk about two other aspects of real maturity. One has to do with this whole idea of transformation from the inside out, like how does that actually happen? And the other aspect of it is just really another element of maturity and growth that I think is important to touch on. All right, so here we go. So this first aspect is becoming like Jesus by being with Jesus. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians. It's Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, and he's really talking about this much larger topic. He's talking about Moses in the Old Testament. He's talking about when Moses met with God and had to cover his face. And so there's this big thing there. But he captures this idea of transformation very simply and very clearly. And you can get lost in the theological jargon if you're not careful, but it shows us something super, super profound, and I think this will be helpful for you. Here's what he says, all right? He says, and this is from the New American Standard version of the Bible. He says, but we all, with unveiled faces, that's a reference to Moses and the topic he was just talking about. He says, looking as in a mirror at the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. Okay, let's break this down a little bit. He says, looking as in a mirror. The word there in the original language can be translated beholding. The NIV, let's see, what does the NIV say? The NIV says contemplate, but the idea is really to, as we more clearly see. The mirror doesn't have too much to do with it. It's just the ancient word was the word people used when they were talking about looking in the mirror, like looking at yourself in the mirror. You're like analyzing the different things in your face. But it's really like contemplating, meditating on what? On the glory of the Lord, all right? So the idea of someone's glory is the essence of who they are, the essence of their goodness. So if you've ever seen The Lion King, right, you can say that you see Mufasa's glory when he throws himself into the stampede to save his son Simba. You see the essence of his love for his son, of his sacrificial nature, of his leadership. Like you see who he is in that moment. You see his glory. And so what Paul's saying is something happens as we more clearly see, or as we contemplate the essence of God's character. What's happening? Well, he says we are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. Or we're being transformed into the same image, other translations say, from one degree of glory to the next, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. Okay, so this is like pretty profound here. The idea is that the more clearly you see God's goodness, the more you become like him. And the more, this is like becoming like Jesus happens by being with Jesus. Well, during the with Jesus, the idea is that you're getting a better understanding of his character, and that changes you from the inside out. Now think about this. Here's how I've seen this in the most practical ways. The people in my life that I have seen to be the most generous are also those who have come to understand God to be super generous. Like they have the clearest understanding of his generosity, not just intellectually, but they like believe it deep down in their bones. The people who are the most forgiving tend to be the people who understand God to be the most forgiving. And the opposite is also true, right? If you see someone who is really judgmental, or let me put it this way, in the seasons of my life when I have been the most judgmental, it's typically when I have believed that God was judgmental, right? Like that's something we tend to become like the God we believe in. And so the more accurately we understand his goodness, the more effectively we will reflect that goodness to other people. If you understand him, the more deeply you understand his love, the more you will more deeply and effectively reflect that love to other people. We're being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to the next. There's a passage where it says, I need to find it, but it basically says, like talking to God, it says, to those, you have shown yourself to be merciful to those who are merciful. And it's that same idea there. It's like those who understand God to be merciful tend to be the most merciful. So that's also a little like behind the scenes here. That's also why we say our mission is to change the way people think about God, meaning we are trying to put God's goodness on display as a church. We say that's our mission, change the way people think about God. And even if you're somebody who understands who God is, our vision of him, our understanding of him is constantly changing. Mine is constantly changing. Ideally, hopefully, I am consistently seeing him more clearly, understanding him more deeply, like getting a clearer and clearer picture of his goodness. And the more I understand that, the more effectively I'll reflect that to other people. So that's a big, big idea when it comes to maturity, but it's not just doing all the Christian stuff. It's not just collecting all the Christian bookmarks or going to all the Christian events, though those are all good things. It's this idea of being transformed from the inside out by more clearly seeing the picture of God's goodness. All right, so the next thing, this is a little bit more practical in nature. It might feel a little bit direct, but I think this is so important to understand when it comes to the long-term sustainability of your spiritual journey, the long-term health of your faith. All right, so think about this. When I'm a baby, right, I am completely dependent on the strength of other people. It starts with my parents, right? They've got to hold me, they've got to feed me, they've got to bottle feed me. As I begin to grow, they begin to give me more and more responsibility, right? So it goes from literally holding the bottle in my mouth to like then spoon feeding me to eventually like giving me the spoon and letting me make a mess of my own face. And then eventually like I'm sitting at the kitchen table and my parents cook me the food, but they give it to me. Now, if you fast forward, now I'm an adult. I'm mature. And theoretically, and I am completely responsible for my own nourishment. I'm completely responsible for my own diet even. I would love it if my mom called me every week and said, hey Lou, here's what you're gonna need to eat this week in order to stay healthy. And it would be even better if she came over and cooked it for me. But she does neither of those things. I mean, sometimes she does come over and cook, but you get the idea, right? Like she doesn't lay out everything I've got to eat. She is not responsible for my health. I am. The same thing is true when it comes to spiritual maturity. In the very beginning stages, you're completely dependent on the strength or on the maturity of other people, right? There are people inviting you in, they're inviting you to groups, they're inviting you to stuff, they're laying things out for you, they're sharing their faith with you. But as you mature, you take more and more responsibility for your own faith. The idea, what we like to say here is like one of our values is owning your growth, owning your growth. You are the only person at the end of the day who can determine whether or not you're growing. You're responsible for your own diet, especially as you're becoming a more and more mature follower of Jesus. Sometimes in the church, and I get this, I've been there, but sometimes in the church we'll get to a certain point, or you'll hear certain people say that they're not being fed. And often what they're saying is they're not being challenged, or they're not being served engaging content that's spurring on the growth of their faith. And I get that, I understand that, but really what I would love is, there came a point where I understood that coming out of my mouth, when I said that, it was the equivalent to me as a mature adult sitting at the table and demanding that somebody come and feed me, right? It's my responsibility. And the further along you get in your journey, the more that this is true. So think about spiritual leaders, right? Think about pastors. Think about me. I don't have the chance to sit in a service every Sunday and listen to someone teach. I would love that. There was a time when I was able to do that. I'm not able to do that anymore. And if I neglect my spiritual diet or my spiritual health, I'm going to wither, right? There's nobody that's making sure I have a balanced spiritual diet. So that's my responsibility. So it's important to me that I'm reading every day. It's important to me that I am listening to other pastors, even if it's not on Sunday morning or Thursday night. But I'm listening to other people. I'm nourishing my faith. That's my job. It's my job to read books that are at a level that makes sense to me, right? It's my responsibility to make sure there are people in my life that are asking me hard questions. It's my responsibility to own my own growth. And this is the mark of maturity. In fact, just like with physical maturity and physical feeding, you get to a point, right, when you reach a place of maturity where other people are dependent on you for their growth. In other words, you're no longer a consumer, or just a consumer, I should say. You're a producer. So my parents, they got to a point where they had to feed themselves, but they also had to make sure that they were feeding those who were relying on their strength, right? The same thing is true from the church. Some of the most mature people in our church here, they're not only responsible for their own faith, but they've also invested in the young, developing faith of other people. Not just young people, but people who are young in a church sense, they're just getting involved here. And so, again, there was a point where I can remember feeling at certain churches, I've outgrown that church, or I need to go somewhere else where I'm going to be fed there. Really what I'm saying in that situation is I'm no longer in a place with this church where I can just be a consumer, right? I need to go find another church where there's different teaching, or a teacher that puts a different spin on things. So I'm challenged for a little while, and I could be a consumer there. And then what eventually happens is I'll get to that place at that church as well. And sometimes, again, this is with the best of intentions. This is because people want to grow and they want to develop. People leave this church to go to other churches because they say they're not being fed. But people also leave other churches to come to this church to say that they're not being fed. And the idea is, eventually, no matter what, you're going to get to a point where you're not being fed if you don't take responsibility for your growth. It's your job as you're maturing to make sure that you're being fed, to own your growth, to take responsibility for your spiritual diet. And at the end of the day, that will serve not only the people around you who are being encouraged by your growth, who are benefiting from the fruit that your faith is producing because you're invested in them, but it will be a benefit to your long-term faith. It will make sure your faith continues to stay fit and healthy throughout your spiritual journey. All right, so those are two things I really wanted to cover that I didn't get a chance to cover during the series, but real maturity, it happens, the how is by being with Jesus, and that happens by better understanding, having a clearer picture of his goodness, and spending time really processing that, beholding as in a mirror, gazing at, spend as much time thinking about that as you spent looking in the mirror this week, and watch what happens to your faith. And the other idea is, when you're mature, it's your responsibility to own your growth. That is a sign of real maturity. So thanks for joining us. I hope that this series was helpful for you. As always, if you got questions, I'd love to talk to you about it. I love questions like that. And otherwise, catch you next time.